The grand ballroom of the Ashworth estate fell silent as Duchess Margaret's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. Her silk gloves trembled with rage as she pointed at the young woman standing frozen near the marble staircase. "She is unworthy!" the Duchess screamed, her words echoing off the gilded walls where New York's most powerful families had gathered for the season's most anticipated engagement announcement. But what happened next would shock society to its core. Her own son, Duke William Ashworth III, slowly descended to one knee before the very woman his mother had just publicly denounced. In that moment, everything everyone thought they knew about love, worth, and power was about to change forever. The autumn of 1895 painted the Hudson Valley in shades of amber and crimson, but inside the towering walls of Ashworth Manor, 22-year-old Rosalind Hayes saw only the cold grey of her predetermined future. As the ward of the powerful Ashworth family, since her parents' tragic death in a railway accident 7 years prior, she had been raised alongside their son William, groomed to be the perfect companion to New York's most eligible bachelor. "Stand straighter, Rosalind," commanded Duchess Margaret Ashworth, her steel-grey eyes scrutinizing every detail of the young woman's posture. "Tonight's dinner party will include the Vanderbilts and the Astors. You must remember your place." The Duchess's words carried the weight of years of careful instruction, each lesson designed to mold Rosalind into an acceptable ornament for her son's arm. Rosalind's fingers traced the intricate beadwork of her emerald evening gown, a gift from the Ashworths that felt more like a uniform than a dress. Through the tall windows of her chambers, she could see the estate's manicured gardens stretching toward the river, beautiful but bounded by iron gates that reminded her daily of her captivity disguised as privilege. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied softly, though her heart yearned for something beyond the suffocating expectations that surrounded her. In quiet moments, she dreamed of traveling to distant cities, of using her mind for something greater than managing household staff and hosting tea parties. She had secretly devoured every book in the manor's vast library, teaching herself French, Italian, and even some basic accounting principles that fascinated her quick mind. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel announced William's return from his business trip to the city. At 26, Duke William Ashworth III possessed the kind of refined handsomeness that graced society pages, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair perfectly styled and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to see everything. Yet lately those eyes had grown distant when they looked upon her, as if he were seeing not Rosalind herself, but merely the role she was expected to fill. "Rosalind," he greeted her with a formal nod as he entered the drawing room, still wearing his travelling coat. "I trust you've been well in my absence?" "Quite well, thank you," she answered, noting how he avoided her gaze. There had been a time, years ago, when they had been genuine friends, racing horses through the countryside, sharing books, laughing until their sides ached. But as they had grown older, the weight of expectation had settled between them like a wall neither seemed able to breach. "Excellent," the Duchess interjected, sweeping into the room with the authority of a woman who had never been denied anything she desired. "Because tomorrow evening we will be hosting a very special dinner party. The Thornfield family will be joining us." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Including their daughter, Miss Charlotte Thornfield." Rosalind felt something cold settle in her stomach. Charlotte Thornfield was everything the Duchess admired. Blonde, beautiful, and blessed with a dowry that could fund a small army. More importantly, she was the daughter of railroad magnate Harrison Thornfield, whose business connections could elevate the Ashworth family's already considerable influence to unprecedented heights. "Mother," William began, but the Duchess raised a jeweled hand to silence him. "The announcement will be made then," she continued, her eyes fixed on Rosalind with unmistakable meaning. "It's time for certain arrangements to be formalized." That night, as rain drummed against her bedroom windows, Rosalind stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror that had witnessed so many years of her captivity. Tomorrow would bring the formal announcement of William's engagement to Charlotte Thornfield, and with it, the end of every secret hope she had harbored in her heart. But what terrified her most was not the loss of a future she had never truly believed could be hers. It was the growing certainty that she was about to discover just how little her years of devotion and sacrifice had truly meant to the family she had served so faithfully. What she didn't know was that tomorrow's dinner party would shatter more than just her dreams. It would expose the true nature of the people she had trusted with her life. The evening of October 15th, 1895, arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the chill settling in Rosalind's heart. The grand dining room of Ashworth Manor had been transformed into a glittering showcase of American aristocracy. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with priceless paintings, while servants in pristine livery moved silently between tables laden with the finest china and silver. Rosalind descended the main staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate chignon that had taken her lady's maid 2 hours to perfect. Yet beneath the elegant facade, her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the mahogany banister. Tonight, she would witness the formal announcement that would seal her fate as nothing more than a discarded piece in the Ashworth family's grand chess game. "Ah, there she is," boomed Harrison Thornfield, a portly man whose gold watch chain stretched across his considerable belly like a badge of his railroad fortune. "The famous ward we've heard so much about." His eyes appraised her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating assets. "Quite lovely, though I suppose that's to be expected when one has had the benefit of Ashworth refinement." Beside him stood Charlotte Thornfield, a vision in pale pink silk that complemented her golden curls and porcelain complexion. At 20, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that graced fashion magazines, but her blue eyes held a coldness that reminded Rosalind of winter frost. "How charming," Charlotte murmured, her voice carrying just enough sweetness to mask the venom beneath. "I do so admire your dress, Miss Hayes, though I suppose it must be difficult, always wearing hand-me-downs." The barb struck its mark, but Rosalind maintained her composure with the grace that years of Duchess Margaret's training had instilled in her. "Thank you, Miss Thornfield. You look absolutely radiant this evening." William appeared at her elbow, resplendent in his formal evening wear, but she noticed the tension in his jaw and the way his eyes seemed to avoid meeting hers directly. "Ladies, shall we proceed to dinner? I believe Cook has prepared something quite special for the occasion." The dining room buzzed with the conversation of New York's elite. The Vanderbilts discussing their latest acquisition of European art, the Astors debating the merits of various investment opportunities, and the Whitneys sharing gossip from their recent trip to Newport. Rosalind found herself seated between elderly Mrs. Astor and young Theodore Whitman, a position that allowed her to observe the evening's proceedings while remaining largely invisible to the main players. As the courses progressed, from delicate oyster soup to perfectly prepared roast duck, Rosalind watched William and Charlotte interact with growing unease. Charlotte's laughter tinkled like silver bells at William's every comment, while she regaled the table with stories of her recent trip to Paris, her fluency in French, and her plans to redecorate her father's Fifth Avenue mansion. Each accomplishment was delivered with the practiced ease of a woman who had never doubted her own worth or place in the world. "Miss Thornfield has such exquisite taste," gushed Mrs. Vanderbilt. "I do believe she would make the perfect mistress for any great estate." "Indeed," agreed Duchess Margaret, her smile sharp with satisfaction. "Some women are simply born to greatness, while others—" Her gaze flickered meaningfully toward Rosalind. "Well, others must be content with more modest aspirations." The comment hung in the air like smoke from the gentlemen's cigars, and Rosalind felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had spent 7 years proving her worth to this family, managing their household affairs with efficiency that impressed even the most demanding guests, speaking 3 languages fluently and demonstrating a head for numbers that had helped streamline their estate's finances. Yet in the Duchess's eyes, she would always be nothing more than a charity case who had forgotten her place. As the final course was cleared away, Harrison Thornfield rose from his seat, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. "My friends," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention, "we have gathered tonight to celebrate not just friendship, but the joining of 2 of America's greatest families." Rosalind's heart began to pound as she realized the moment had arrived. Around the table, conversations ceased as all eyes turned toward the head of the table where William sat, his face pale but resolute. "It gives me tremendous pleasure," Thornfield continued, "to announce the engagement of my beloved daughter Charlotte to Duke William Ashworth III. May their union bring prosperity and happiness to both our houses." The room erupted in applause and congratulations, but Rosalind heard it all as if from underwater. She watched as William stood slowly, his movements mechanical, and reached for Charlotte's hand. The blonde beauty rose gracefully, her face glowing with triumph as she accepted the kiss William placed formally on her gloved knuckles. "To the happy couple!" called out Mr. Vanderbilt, raising his crystal goblet high. But as the toasts continued and the congratulations flowed like champagne, Rosalind noticed something that made her blood run cold. Charlotte's eyes had found hers across the table, and in them was not the joy of a woman in love, but the cold satisfaction of a predator who had successfully claimed her prey. "Poor dear," Charlotte said, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "I do hope this won't be too difficult for you, Miss Hayes. I know how attached you've become to the family." The words were delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes, "but I'm sure you understand that some positions in life are simply not meant for everyone." The cruelty of the comment struck Rosalind like a physical blow. Around the table, she could see the knowing looks, the barely concealed smirks of people who had always viewed her as an amusing curiosity, the orphaned ward who had dared to dream above her station. Duchess Margaret's voice cut through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "Indeed, it's time for certain people to understand their proper place in the world. Some are born to lead, while others—" She paused, her steel-grey eyes fixed on Rosalind with unmistakable meaning. "Others are meant to serve." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Rosalind felt the walls of the elegant dining room closing in around her. 7 years of devotion, of sacrifice, of believing herself to be part of this family, all of it reduced to nothing more than an inconvenient obligation that could be discarded the moment it no longer served their purposes. William's eyes finally met hers across the table, and in them she saw not love or even regret, but a kind of resigned acceptance that cut deeper than any blade. He had made his choice, and it was not her. As the evening continued around her, the laughter, the congratulations, the planning of wedding details, Rosalind sat frozen in her chair, feeling as though she were watching her own funeral. The life she had known, the future she had dared to hope for, the very identity she had built within these walls, all of it was crumbling to dust before her eyes. But what hurt most of all was the growing realization that perhaps she had never truly belonged here at all. Perhaps she had been nothing more than a convenient placeholder, kept around until a more suitable candidate could be found. The thought was so devastating that she could barely breathe. How could she have been so blind to the truth that everyone else seemed to have known all along? The morning after the engagement announcement dawned grey and bitter, matching the desolation that had settled in Rosalind's heart like winter frost. She had barely slept, spending the long hours before dawn, staring out her window at the Hudson River, watching the mist rise from the water, like the ghosts of her shattered dreams. By the time the household began to stir, she had made her decision. "I must leave," she whispered to her reflection in the mirror, her voice hoarse from the tears she had finally allowed herself to shed in the privacy of her chambers. The face that looked back at her seemed older somehow, as if the events of the previous evening had aged her beyond her 22 years. Her lady's maid, Sarah, a kind Irish woman who had been more friend than servant over the years, helped her pack her few personal belongings with quiet efficiency. "Where will you go, miss?" Sarah asked, her voice thick with concern. "To my great-aunt Cordelia in Boston," Rosalind replied, folding the simple travelling dress that had belonged to her mother. "She's the only family I have left." Aunt Cordelia Hayes was her father's sister, a spinster who had made her own way in the world as a teacher and had written occasionally over the years, though the Duchess had always discouraged correspondence. The confrontation with Duchess Margaret was as brutal as Rosalind had expected. The older woman received her in the morning room, her face a mask of cold displeasure as she sipped her tea from delicate Limoges china. "So you're running away," the Duchess said without preamble, not bothering to look up from her correspondence. "How perfectly predictable. I had hoped that 7 years in this house might have instilled some backbone in you, but I see I was mistaken." "I am not running away, Your Grace," Rosalind replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am simply recognizing that my time here has come to an end. You've made it quite clear that I no longer have a place in this family." The Duchess finally looked up, her steel-grey eyes glittering with something that might have been amusement. "My dear child, you never had a place in this family. You were a charity case, nothing more. A project to keep me occupied while William was away at university. Did you truly believe that we would allow our son to throw away his future on a penniless orphan?" The words struck like physical blows, but Rosalind forced herself to remain standing. "I believed that kindness and loyalty might count for something. I was wrong." "Indeed you were." The Duchess returned to her letters with dismissive finality. "You may take the morning train to Boston. I'll have the carriage brought around." William found her in the entrance hall as she waited for her transportation, her single trunk beside her, like a monument to the simplicity of her true circumstances. He looked haggard, as if he too had spent a sleepless night, but when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of resignation. "Rosalind, He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "I want you to know that this isn't what I wanted." "But it's what you chose," she replied quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And perhaps that's what matters most." He stepped closer, and for a moment she saw a flash of the boy she had once known, the one who had taught her to ride and had shared his dreams of traveling the world. "My mother is right about one thing. I have responsibilities, obligations that go beyond my personal desires. The Thornfield Alliance will secure our family's position for generations." "And what of love, William? What of choosing one's own path?" His laugh was bitter. "Love is a luxury that men in my position cannot afford. Surely you understand that." The carriage arrived before she could respond, and as Rosalind settled into the worn leather seat for the journey to the train station, she realized that she was not just leaving Ashworth Manor, she was leaving behind the last remnants of her childhood, and the naive belief that virtue and devotion would be rewarded. The train journey to Boston took most of the day, the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails providing a hypnotic backdrop to her churning thoughts. As the Hudson Valley gave way to the rolling hills of Massachusetts, Rosalind felt something unexpected stirring within her. Not just grief for what she had lost, but a strange sense of anticipation for what might lie ahead. Aunt Cordelia's brownstone on Beacon Hill was a revelation. Unlike the oppressive grandeur of Ashworth Manor, this house felt alive with warmth and intellectual energy. Books lined every wall. Newspapers in multiple languages cluttered the tables, and the scent of ink and paper mingled with the aroma of strong coffee. Cordelia Hayes herself was nothing like the stern spinster Rosalind had imagined. At 55, she was a handsome woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that sparkled with curiosity and humor. She embraced her great niece with genuine warmth, her voice carrying the slight Irish lilt that had been bred out of Rosalind during her years with the Ashworths. "My dear child," Cordelia said, holding Rosalind at arm's length to study her face. "You look like you've been through a war. Come, let's get some proper food in you, and you can tell me everything." Over dinner in the cosy kitchen, a far cry from the formal dining rooms Rosalind was accustomed to, she found herself pouring out the entire story. Cordelia listened without judgment, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed a sharp understanding of society's machinations. "So they kept you as a pet," Cordelia said finally, her voice tinged with anger. "Dressed you up, taught you tricks, and then discarded you when you were no longer useful. How perfectly typical of their kind." "I thought I belonged there," Rosalind admitted, tears threatening again. "I thought I was part of their family. You belong to yourself, child, and you always have. The mistake was in forgetting that." Cordelia reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "But perhaps this is exactly what you needed, a chance to discover who Rosalind Hayes truly is, not who the Ashworths wanted her to be." Over the following weeks, Rosalind began to understand what her aunt meant. Cordelia was involved in the women's suffrage movement, hosting meetings in her parlor where passionate, intelligent women debated politics and social reform with an intensity that both thrilled and intimidated Rosalind. She had never heard women speak so freely about their opinions, their ambitions, their refusal to accept the limitations society placed upon them. "You have a fine mind," Cordelia observed one evening as they reviewed the household accounts together. Rosalind had quickly identified several areas where expenses could be reduced and income increased. "Have you ever considered that there might be more to life than managing someone else's household?" The question planted a seed that began to grow with surprising speed. Through Cordelia's connections, Rosalind began attending lectures at Harvard's extension program, where she discovered a passion for economics and social reform that had been dormant during her years of enforced domesticity. Her quick grasp of complex financial concepts impressed her professors, and for the first time in her life, she felt valued for her intellect rather than her ability to pour tea and make polite conversation. It was at one of these lectures, on a crisp November evening, that she first encountered Dr. Elias Reed. He was delivering a talk on urban poverty and economic reform, his tall, lean frame commanding the podium with quiet authority. Unlike the polished aristocrats she had known, Dr. Reed possessed a different kind of magnetism, the appeal of a man driven by genuine conviction rather than social ambition. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it while preparing his notes, and his brown eyes burned with passion as he spoke about the need for systematic change to address the growing inequality in American cities. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a man who had worked for everything he possessed. "The current system," he was saying, his voice carrying easily through the packed lecture hall, "treats poverty as a moral failing rather than a structural problem. Until we address the root causes, inadequate wages, unsafe working conditions, lack of access to education, we will continue to see the same cycles of desperation and despair." Rosalind found herself leaning forward, captivated not just by his words, but by the obvious sincerity behind them. This was a man who cared about something beyond his own advancement, who saw the world's problems as challenges to be solved rather than inconveniences to be ignored. After the lecture, as the crowd began to disperse, she found herself approaching the podium where Dr. Reed was gathering his papers. "Excuse me," she said, her voice slightly breathless with nervousness. "I wanted to thank you for such an illuminating presentation." He looked up, and she was struck by the directness of his gaze. Unlike William's polite but distant attention, Dr. Reed's eyes seemed to actually see her, not her dress or her social position, but something deeper. "You're very kind," he replied, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "I don't believe we've been introduced." I'm Elias Reed. Rosalind Hayes, she responded, accepting his offered handshake. His grip was firm and warm, the hands of a man who wasn't afraid of honest work. Hayes, he repeated thoughtfully. Are you by any chance related to Cordelia Hayes? She's been a tremendous supporter of our work with the settlement houses. She's my great-aunt, Rosalind said, surprised and pleased by the connection. Then you must be the young woman she's been telling us about, the one with the remarkable head for figures. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made her heart skip unexpectedly. She mentioned that you've been attending the extension lectures. What brings you to the study of economics? For the first time in months, Rosalind found herself speaking freely about her interests, her growing passion for understanding how society's structures could be reformed to create more opportunity for those born without privilege. Dr. Nuss. Reed listened with the kind of attention she had never received from the men in her previous life, asking thoughtful questions that challenged her thinking and encouraged her to explore ideas she had barely dared to consider. You should consider joining our discussion group, he said, as their conversation drew to a natural close. We meet every Thursday evening to debate these very issues. I think you'd find the conversation stimulating. As Rosalind walked home through the gaslit streets of Beacon Hill, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Ashworth Manor. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of her final days there, but something stronger and more substantial. For the first time in her life, she was being valued for who she truly was, rather than who others wanted her to be. But what she didn't yet realize was that this new world she was discovering would soon put her on a collision course with the very people who had cast her aside, and that the next time she faced them, she would be armed with something far more powerful than their approval, her own unshakable sense of worth. By the spring of 1896, Rosalind Hayes had transformed into someone the Ashworth family would barely recognize. 6 months of intellectual freedom had awakened a confidence that radiated from within, replacing the careful deference that had once defined her every movement. Her involvement with Dr. Reed's reform circles had sharpened her mind and strengthened her convictions, while Aunt Cordelia's unwavering support had taught her to value her own worth independent of others' approval. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, delivered by a liveried messenger who seemed surprised to find himself in the modest but respectable neighborhood of Beacon Hill. The heavy cream paper bore the Ashworth family crest, and Rosalind's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. The Duke and Duchess of Ashworth request the honor of your presence at the wedding celebration of Duke William Ashworth III and Miss Charlotte Thornfield, she read aloud to Cordelia, who was tending to her morning correspondence at the kitchen table. How perfectly predictable, Cordelia snorted, not looking up from her letters. They want you there as a trophy, proof that they can discard you and still command your attendance at their pleasure. Rosalind studied the elegant script, noting that the ceremony itself was to be a private affair, but the reception would be held at the newly completed Ashworth Ballroom in their Fifth Avenue mansion. It was to be the social event of the season, with guests including the Vanderbilts, Astors and Whitneys, along with prominent figures from business and politics. I should decline, Rosalind said, though something in her voice suggested she was not entirely convinced. Should you? Cordelia finally looked up, her green eyes sharp with interest. Or should you attend and show them exactly what they threw away? The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. For months, Rosalind had been building a new life, but part of her healing process required facing the people who had wounded her, not as the broken, desperate girl who had fled their house, but as the confident woman she had become. Doctor. Reed mentioned that several prominent reformers would be attending. Cordelia continued thoughtfully. The Ashworths are trying to court political favor for their railroad investments, so they've invited some unexpected guests. It might be an opportunity to advance our cause as well as your own closure. That evening, Rosalind found herself discussing the invitation with Elias during one of their regular walks along the Charles River. Their relationship had deepened over the months, built on mutual respect and shared passion for social justice. Unlike her previous attachment to William, which had been based on proximity and expectation, her feelings for Elias grew from genuine admiration for his character and intellect. "You're afraid," he observed gently as they paused to watch the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Terrified," she admitted. "What if seeing them again undoes all the progress I've made? What if I revert to that frightened, desperate girl who believed her worth depended on their approval?" Elias turned to face her, his brown eyes serious but kind. "The woman I know, the one who can debate economic theory with Harvard professors and organize relief efforts for striking workers, that woman doesn't exist because of their approval or disapproval. She exists because she chose to become herself." His words gave her the courage she needed. The next morning, she sent her acceptance to the Ashworth invitation, along with a request to bring Dr. Elias Reed as her escort, a small act of defiance that felt monumentally significant. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Cordelia insisted on commissioning a new gown for the occasion, something that would announce Rosalind's transformation without appearing to try too hard. They settled on a creation in deep sapphire silk that complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green in her eyes. The design was elegant but modern, with clean lines that spoke of confidence rather than the fussy ornamentation favored by society matrons. "You look like a woman who knows her own mind," Cordelia declared as Rosalind stood before the mirror on the morning of the reception. "That's the most beautiful thing any woman can wear." Noon. The Ashworth Fifth Avenue mansion had been transformed for the occasion, with thousands of white roses and trailing ivy, creating an atmosphere of romantic grandeur. As Rosalind and Elias climbed the marble steps, she felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but her outward composure remained steady. The receiving line was a gauntlet of familiar faces, each registering varying degrees of surprise at her appearance. She had grown more beautiful in her months away, but it was a different kind of beauty, one that came from inner strength rather than careful grooming to please others. "Miss Hayes," Duchess Margaret's voice was arctic as she extended a gloved hand. "How unexpected to see you here." "Your Grace," Rosalind replied with a graceful curtsy that was perfectly correct, but notably brief. "Thank you for including me in this joyous occasion. May I present Dr. Elias Reed?" The Duchess's eyes flickered over Elias with barely concealed disdain, taking in his well-tailored but obviously not custom-made evening wear, his calloused hands, and his direct, unintimidated gaze. "Dr. Reed, how interesting." William stood beside his new bride, resplendent in formal evening wear, but looking somehow diminished next to Charlotte's radiant triumph. When his eyes met Rosalind's, she saw a flash of something, regret, perhaps, or recognition of what he had lost, but it passed quickly, replaced by the careful mask of social propriety. "Rosalind," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you look well." "I am well, thank you," she replied, her tone equally polite, but carrying an undertone of steel that hadn't been there before. "Congratulations on your marriage." Charlotte, magnificent in ivory, silk, and pearls, studied Rosalind with the calculating gaze of a woman assessing potential competition. "Miss Hayes, how lovely that you could attend. I do hope you're finding suitable employment in Boston." The barb was delivered with a smile, but Rosalind met it with serene confidence. "I'm involved in several reform initiatives, actually. Dr. Reed and I are working on legislation to improve working conditions in textile factories. It's quite fulfilling to use one's abilities for meaningful purpose." The subtle emphasis on meaningful purpose was not lost on anyone present, and Charlotte's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. As the evening progressed, Rosalind found herself moving through the familiar rooms with a strange sense of detachment. The opulent surroundings that had once intimidated her now seemed merely decorative, impressive, but ultimately hollow. She was no longer the girl who had believed that belonging to this world was the height of achievement. "You're causing quite a stir," Elias murmured as they waltzed together in the grand ballroom. "Half the room is trying to figure out who you are, and the other half is whispering about your transformation." "Good," Rosalind replied, surprised by her own boldness. "Let them wonder." The evening's most significant moment came during the dinner service, when Harrison Thornfield rose to make a toast. His face was flushed with wine and satisfaction as he surveyed the assembled guests, the cream of New York society, all gathered to celebrate his daughter's triumph. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying the authority of immense wealth, "tonight we celebrate not just the union of two young people, but the joining of two great American dynasties. The Thornfield-Ashworth alliance represents the very best of our nation's future, the marriage of old money refinement with new world enterprise." Polite applause rippled through the room, but Rosalind noticed several of the reform-minded guests exchanging meaningful glances. The casual dismissal of new world enterprise as somehow lesser than inherited wealth was exactly the kind of attitude their movement sought to challenge. "Some might say," Thornfield continued, his gaze sweeping over the room with proprietary satisfaction, "that in America anyone can rise to greatness. But we who have achieved true success know better. Breeding tells, my friends. Quality recognizes quality. There are those born to lead and those born to follow, and no amount of education or ambition can change the fundamental order of things." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rosalind felt something crystallize within her. This was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for, not just to face her past, but to reject everything it represented. She rose from her seat with fluid grace, her sapphire gown catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward her, and she could feel the collective intake of breath as society's elite recognized the girl they had dismissed and forgotten. "If I may," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet, "I would like to offer my own toast." Duchess Margaret's face had gone white with fury, but she was trapped by the rules of social propriety that prevented her from creating a scene in front of such distinguished guests. "To the bride and groom," Rosalind continued, raising her crystal goblet with steady hands, "and to the truth that in America worth is not determined by birth or breeding, but by character and contribution. May we all have the courage to choose our own paths, regardless of what others might consider our proper place." The toast was met with a mixture of shocked silence and scattered applause, mostly from the reform-minded guests who appreciated the subtle but unmistakable challenge to the evening's prevailing attitudes. Charlotte's face had flushed an unbecoming shade of red, while William stared at Rosalind with something approaching awe. But it was Duchess Margaret's reaction that provided the evening's most dramatic moment. Rising from her seat with trembling fury, she pointed an accusatory finger at Rosalind, her voice shaking with rage. "How dare you?" she shrieked, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "How dare you come into my home and insult your betters? You are nothing but a charity case, a nobody who has forgotten her place." The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but before anyone could respond, something extraordinary happened. William Ashworth III, Duke of the family empire, slowly rose from his seat. His face was pale but determined as he looked at his mother, then at his new bride, and finally at Rosalind. "Mother," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden hush, "you are wrong." And then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone present, he stepped away from the head table and walked deliberately across the room to where Rosalind stood. The gasps and whispers of the assembled guests created a symphony of shock as New York's most eligible bachelor, now married to another woman, slowly, deliberately sank to one knee before the woman his family had cast aside. "Rosalind," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I owe you an apology that is 6 months overdue. You are not unworthy. You never were. The unworthiness was mine, for lacking the courage to choose love over duty, for allowing others to define your value, for being too weak to defend what I knew in my heart was right." The silence in the room was deafening. Charlotte stood frozen at the head table, her face a mask of humiliation and rage, while Duchess Margaret looked as though she might faint. But Rosalind, looking down at the man who had once held her heart, felt only a profound sense of closure. "Thank you, William," she said gently, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. "But I no longer need your apology. I've learned that my worth was never yours to give or take away." She extended her hand to help him rise, a gesture of forgiveness that somehow managed to be both gracious and final. As he stood, she could see in his eyes the recognition of what he had lost, not just her love, but the chance to be the man he might have been. The evening ended in chaos, with guests departing in shocked whispers and the Ashworth family retreating to deal with the social catastrophe that had just unfolded. But as Rosalind and Elias walked out into the cool spring night, she felt lighter than she had in years. "That," Elias said quietly as they descended the marble steps, "was magnificent." "It was necessary," she replied, taking his offered arm. "I needed to see that they no longer had any power over me." But even as they walked away from the mansion and the life she had once desperately wanted, Rosalind couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was only the beginning. She had found her strength and her voice, but the real test would come in, using them to build something meaningful, not just for herself, but for all the women who had been told they were unworthy of their dreams. What she didn't yet know was that her public rejection of society's limitations would soon open doors she had never imagined, leading to opportunities that would allow her to change not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had been dismissed and forgotten by those in power. The scandal of William Ashworth's public genuflection before his former ward dominated New York society pages for weeks following the wedding reception. Headlines screamed variations of "Duke kneels before cast-off ward" and "Society stunned by Ashworth heir's dramatic apology," while editorial writers debated the implications of such unprecedented behavior among the city's elite. But for Rosalind, the aftermath brought something far more valuable than notoriety. It brought opportunity. Within days of the reception, her modest Beacon Hill address was flooded with correspondence from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, wrote personally to invite Rosalind to speak at a women's reform meeting in New York. The editor of Harper's Bazaar requested an interview about the modern woman's place in society. Most significantly, the board of directors of the newly established Settlement House Association offered her a position as coordinator of their Boston operations, a role that would allow her to put her organizational skills and economic knowledge to work improving conditions for the city's most vulnerable residents. "You've become a symbol," Cordelia observed one morning as they sorted through the latest batch of letters over breakfast. "Whether you intended it or not, your confrontation with the Ashworths has made you a voice for every woman who has been told she doesn't belong." Rosalind set down a particularly effusive letter from a women's suffrage organization in Philadelphia. "I never wanted to be a symbol, I just wanted to be myself." Sometimes, Elias said from his place at the kitchen table, he had become a regular fixture at their morning discussions. "Being yourself is the most radical act possible. You've shown that a woman can reject the role society assigns her and create her own path. That's revolutionary." The truth of his words became apparent as Rosalind threw herself into her new work with the Settlement House Association. The position required her to coordinate services for immigrant families, organize educational programs for working women, and manage the complex finances of multiple charitable initiatives. It was demanding work that utilized every skill she had developed during her years managing the Ashworth household. But now those abilities served a purpose that filled her with genuine satisfaction. Her first major project involved establishing a series of evening classes for young women employed in the textile factories that dotted Boston's industrial districts. These women, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, worked 12-hour days in dangerous conditions for wages that barely covered their basic needs. Yet despite their exhaustion, dozens of them gathered each evening in the settlement house's converted classroom, hungry for the education that might lift them from poverty. "Miss Hayes," said Maria Benedetti, a 17-year-old Italian girl whose fingers were permanently stained from the dyes used in the textile mill, "you really think we can learn to read and write like proper ladies?" "I think you can learn to read and write like intelligent women," Rosalind replied, carefully avoiding the class distinctions that had once seemed so important to her. "And I think that knowledge will give you choices you don't have now." Late, the work was transformative, not just for the women she taught, but for Rosalind herself. Each evening, as she watched these young women struggle to form letters and sound out words despite their bone-deep fatigue, she was reminded of her own journey from dependence to independence. The difference was that these women faced obstacles far greater than social disapproval. They battled poverty, language barriers, and a society that viewed them as disposable labor rather than human beings with potential. It was during one of these evening classes that Rosalind received an unexpected visitor. She was helping Maria work through a particularly challenging passage when the settlement house director, Mrs. Catherine Morrison, appeared in the doorway with a familiar figure in tow. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice carefully neutral, "you have a visitor." Rosalind looked up to see Charlotte Thornfield, now Charlotte Ashworth, standing in the doorway of the humble classroom. The new Duchess was magnificently dressed in a burgundy velvet traveling costume that probably cost more than most of the students earned in a year. But her usual air of supreme confidence seemed somewhat diminished. "Mrs. Ashworth," Rosalind said, rising from her seat beside Maria, "this is unexpected." "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Charlotte replied, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I was hoping we might speak privately." Rosalind glanced at her students, who were watching the exchange with undisguised curiosity. "Ladies, please continue with your reading exercises. I'll return shortly." She led Charlotte to a small office adjacent to the classroom, noting how the other woman's eyes took in the simple furnishings and worn books with something that might have been surprise. Charlotte had clearly never seen poverty up close, and the reality of the settlement house seemed to unsettle her. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," Charlotte began, settling herself carefully in the room's single visitor chair. "The thought had occurred to me," Rosalind replied, remaining standing. She had learned that maintaining physical authority often helped in difficult conversations. Charlotte was silent for a long moment, her gloved hands fidgeting with the clasp of her expensive handbag. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Rosalind had ever heard it. "My marriage is not what I expected it to be." The admission hung in the air between them, and Rosalind felt a complex mixture of emotions, surprise, sympathy, and a small, unworthy satisfaction that she immediately suppressed. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me." "Because you knew him," Charlotte continued, her composure beginning to crack. "You knew William in a way that I never will. He goes through the motions of being a husband, but his heart isn't in it. He's polite, dutiful, everything a gentleman should be, but there's no passion, no real connection. It's like being married to a beautiful statue." Rosalind felt a pang of sympathy for the woman who had once seemed like her greatest enemy. "Charlotte, I know what you're thinking," Charlotte interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "That I got what I deserved, that I stole him from you, and now I'm paying the price. And perhaps you're right, but I didn't come here for your pity." Then why did you come? Charlotte stood and walked to the small window that overlooked the settlement house's courtyard, where children from the neighborhood played despite the autumn chill. Because I've been watching you, she said quietly. Reading about your work, hearing about the changes you're making, and I realized something that terrifies me. What's that? You're happy. Charlotte turned back to face her, and Rosalind was startled to see tears in the other woman's eyes. Genuinely, authentically happy in a way that I've never been. You have purpose, meaning work that matters. You have a man who looks at you like you're the most fascinating person in the world. You have everything I thought I wanted, except you built it yourself instead of marrying into it. The honesty of the admission was so unexpected that Rosalind found herself speechless. This was not the calculating, cruel woman she remembered from the Ashworth dining room, but someone who seemed genuinely lost and searching for direction. I don't know what you want me to say, Rosalind said finally. I want you to tell me how you did it, Charlotte replied, her voice urgent now. How you walked away from everything you thought you wanted and built something better. How you found the courage to choose your own path when everyone was telling you to stay in your place. Rosalind studied the other woman's face, seeing past the perfect features and expensive clothes to the desperation beneath. It wasn't courage, Charlotte. It was necessity. I had to choose between being true to myself and being what others wanted me to be. The choice became clear when I realized that their approval would never be enough to make me happy. Now, but how do you know what you want? How do you know what path to choose? You start by asking yourself what makes you feel alive, Rosalind said, thinking of her students in the next room, of the satisfaction she felt when she saw understanding dawn in their eyes. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? What problems in the world make you angry enough to want to fix them? Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. I've spent my entire life being what my father wanted, then what William's family expected. I don't know who I am underneath all of that. Then that's where you start, Rosalind said gently. You figure out who Charlotte Ashworth is when she's not trying to be anyone else. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the classroom, and Rosalind excused herself to find Maria Benedetti in tears over a letter she had been struggling to read. It was from her younger brother in Italy, and she had finally managed to decipher enough of it to understand that their mother was seriously ill. I need to go home, Maria sobbed, but I don't have the money for passage, and if I leave my job, they won't take me back. Without hesitation, Rosalind knelt beside the girl's chair. We'll figure something out, she promised. There are organizations that help with emergency travel, and I know people who might be able to arrange temporary work for you in Italy. As she comforted Maria and began making mental notes about who she could contact for help, Rosalind was aware of Charlotte watching from the doorway. When she finally looked up, she saw something new in the other woman's expression. Not the calculating assessment she was used to, but genuine interest and perhaps even admiration. After the class ended and the students had departed into the Boston night, Charlotte approached Rosalind again. That girl, she said quietly. You really think you can help her? I'm going to try, Rosalind replied, already composing letters in her head to various charitable organizations and immigrant aid societies. May I help? The question seemed to surprise Charlotte as much as it did Rosalind. I have money, connections. Surely there's something I could do. Rosalind studied her carefully, looking for signs of the old manipulation or self-serving motives. But what she saw was a woman genuinely searching for purpose, for a way to matter beyond her marriage and social position. There's always something that needs doing, she said finally. But it's not glamorous work, Charlotte. It's long hours and heartbreaking stories and small victories that nobody will write about in the society pages. Maybe that's exactly what I need, Charlotte replied. Maybe I'm tired of being written about in the society pages. Over the following weeks, Charlotte became a regular presence at the settlement house, initially helping with fundraising and administrative tasks, but gradually taking on more direct service work. She proved surprisingly adept at organizing relief efforts and had a talent for persuading wealthy donors to open their purses for causes they had previously ignored. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The sharp edges of Charlotte's personality softened as she found genuine purpose in helping others, and her natural intelligence, previously channeled into social maneuvering, found more meaningful outlets in problem-solving and advocacy. "She's not the same person," Elias observed one evening as he and Rosalind walked home from a particularly successful fundraising event that Charlotte had organized. "It's like watching someone wake up from a long sleep." "People can change," Rosalind replied, thinking of her own journey from desperate ward to confident reformer. "Sometimes they just need the right circumstances to discover who they really are." The most significant test of Charlotte's transformation came when the textile workers announced a strike to protest dangerous working conditions and wage cuts. The mill owners, including some of the Ashworth family's business associates, expected the city's elite to support their position against the ungrateful workers. Charlotte surprised everyone, including herself, by publicly supporting the strikers and using her social connections to pressure the mill owners to negotiate. The decision created a rift with her husband's family and many of her former friends, but she seemed liberated rather than distressed by their disapproval. "I finally understand what you meant," she told Rosalind during one of their planning meetings for strike relief efforts, "about choosing your own path. For the first time in my life, I'm doing something because I believe it's right, not because someone else expects it of me." The strike lasted 3 weeks and ended with significant concessions from the mill owners, including improved safety measures and a modest wage increase. More importantly for Rosalind, it demonstrated that change was possible when people were willing to stand up for their principles, regardless of the social cost. As winter settled over Boston, Rosalind found herself reflecting on the extraordinary changes the year had brought. She had lost the life she thought she wanted and discovered a purpose she had never imagined. She had gained not just Elias's love, but his partnership in work that mattered to both of them. Most surprisingly, she had found an unlikely ally in the woman who had once seemed like her greatest enemy. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. The desperate need for approval that had once driven her every action had been replaced by a quiet confidence in her own judgment and worth. She no longer measured her success by others' opinions, but by the tangible difference she was making in the lives of people who had been forgotten by society. One snowy evening in December, as she and Elias walked home from a settlement house board meeting, he stopped suddenly and turned to face her. "Marry me," he said simply, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The proposal was so unexpected and so perfectly him, direct, honest, without artifice or elaborate staging, that she laughed with pure joy. "Yes," she said, stepping into his arms. "Yes, absolutely yes." As they stood there in the falling snow, Rosalind realized that this moment, simple, genuine, chosen freely, was worth more than all the grand gestures and elaborate ceremonies she had once dreamed of. She had found not just love, but partnership with someone who valued her mind as much as her heart, who shared her commitment to making the world better for those who had been left behind. The announcement of their engagement would create another small scandal in certain circles, but Rosalind found that she no longer cared about the opinions of people whose approval had once seemed so important. She had learned the difference between being accepted and being valued, between fitting in and belonging, between being chosen by others and choosing for herself. But even as she celebrated this new chapter of her life, she couldn't shake the feeling that her story was far from over. The work she had begun would continue to grow and evolve, and she sensed that the greatest challenges and opportunities still lay ahead. What she didn't yet know was that her example would inspire a generation of women to reject the limitations society placed upon them and demand the right to define their own worth and choose their own destinies. 2 years had passed since that snowy December evening when Elias proposed, and the spring of 1898 found Rosalind Reed, she had taken her husband's name with pride, standing before the newly constructed Boston Women's Educational Center, a magnificent 4-story brick building that represented the culmination of everything she had worked toward since leaving Ashworth Manor. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Cordelia Hayes, Memorial Center for Women's Advancement," honoring her great-aunt who had passed peacefully the previous winter, leaving her considerable estate to fund Rosalind's expanding reform efforts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the building's facade as Rosalind paused to savor this moment of quiet before the day's activities began. The structure itself was a testament to thoughtful design. Large windows flooded the interior with natural light. Wide corridors accommodated the flow of students and visitors, and the ground floor featured a spacious auditorium where community meetings and lectures could be held. In a few hours, the center would be bustling with activity: literacy classes for immigrant women, vocational training programs, childcare services for working mothers, and meeting rooms where the city's growing women's suffrage movement gathered to plan their campaigns. But for now, in the peaceful dawn light, she allowed herself to reflect on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. The frightened girl who had fled Ashworth Manor seemed like a different person entirely. Someone she remembered with compassion, but could barely recognize in herself. That girl had believed her worth depended on others' approval. This woman knew her value came from her own choices and contributions. "Admiring your handiwork?" came a familiar voice behind her. Rosalind turned to see Charlotte approaching, her arms full of files and her practical navy dress a far cry from the elaborate gowns she had once favored. Charlotte had become the center's most dedicated volunteer coordinator, throwing herself into the work with the same intensity she had once reserved for social climbing. Her transformation had been as dramatic as Rosalind's own. The sharp-tongued society belle had evolved into a compassionate advocate for women's rights, her natural intelligence finally channeled toward meaningful purpose. "Our handiwork," Rosalind corrected with a smile. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." It was true. Charlotte's connections and fundraising abilities had been instrumental in securing the donations needed to purchase and renovate the building. More importantly, her transformation from society belle to dedicated reformer had inspired other wealthy women to question their own assumptions about purpose and fulfillment. The ripple effect of her change had been extraordinary. At least a dozen prominent New York and Boston families had redirected their charitable giving toward more systematic approaches to social reform. "The morning mail brought some interesting correspondence," Charlotte said, handing Rosalind a thick envelope bearing the seal of Harvard University. "I think you'll want to read this privately." Rosalind's heart quickened as she recognized the formal letterhead. For months, she had been in correspondence with the university's extension program about a revolutionary proposal: the establishment of a formal degree program in social work, the first of its kind in the country. Her detailed curriculum proposals and supporting documentation had been under review by the academic committee for weeks. The waiting had been agonizing, as she knew this decision could determine whether professional social work would be recognized as a legitimate field of study or remain relegated to volunteer charity work. She retreated to her office on the building's second floor, a modest but comfortable space overlooking the center's courtyard, where children played while their mothers attended classes. The room reflected her practical approach to leadership: functional furniture, walls lined with books on economics and social theory, and a large desk covered with correspondence from women across the country, seeking advice on establishing similar programs in their own communities. The morning light streamed through tall windows as she carefully opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation. The weight of the packet suggested a substantial response, which could be either very good news or very bad news, delivered with extensive explanation. "Dear Mrs. Reed," the letter began, The Committee on Academic Innovation is pleased to inform you that your proposal for a Bachelor of Social Work degree program has been approved for implementation beginning with the fall 1898 semester. Furthermore, the committee unanimously recommends your appointment as the program's first director, with the rank of assistant professor. Rosalind sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was reading. Not only had Harvard approved her revolutionary program, but they were offering her a position that would make her one of the first women to hold a professorial rank at the prestigious institution. The salary they proposed was more than generous, enough to ensure financial security for herself and Elias while allowing them to continue their reform work. More importantly, the opportunity to shape the education of future social workers was beyond anything she had dared to dream. The letter continued with details that made her heart race with excitement. The university was committing to a 4-year pilot program with the possibility of permanent establishment based on results. They were providing funding for a dedicated building, library resources, and support staff. Most remarkably, they were accepting her recommendation that admission be based on demonstrated commitment to social justice rather than traditional academic credentials, opening the program to working-class women who had practical experience but lacked formal education. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, still staring at the letter in disbelief. Elias entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the gentle smile that never failed to make her heart skip. His own work had flourished alongside hers. His research on urban poverty had gained national recognition, and his book on economic inequality was being used in universities across the country. But more than professional success, their marriage had deepened into a partnership that strengthened both of them. "Charlotte said you received important news. Good or bad?" "Extraordinary," she managed, handing him the letter. "They said yes, Elias, to everything." He read quickly, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement to pure joy. "Rosalind, this is going to change everything. You're going to train an entire generation of social workers, people who will go out and transform communities across the country." "We're going to train them," she corrected. "The letter mentions that they're also interested in your research on urban poverty. They want to offer you a position as well." The next few hours passed in a blur of excitement and planning. Word of Rosalind's appointment spread quickly through the center, and by afternoon the building was filled with congratulatory visitors. Maria Benedetti, now fluent in English and working as a translator for the Immigrant Services Office, brought flowers from the Italian women's group. The young woman had blossomed under the center's programs, her natural intelligence finally given room to flourish. She was planning to apply for the new Harvard program, determined to become an advocate for immigrant rights. Mrs. Morrison from the settlement house arrived with a bottle of champagne, declaring that this was exactly the kind of recognition the reform movement needed. Representatives from women's organizations across New England sent telegrams of congratulation, many expressing interest in sending their most promising members to study in the new program. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the women who had been Rosalind's first students at the center. They gathered in the main hall that afternoon, many bringing their children and all radiating pride in their teacher's achievement. These were women who had arrived at the center barely able to read, who had worked 12-hour days in dangerous factories while dreaming of something better for themselves and their families. Now, many of them were literate, some had found better employment, and several were planning to apply for the Harvard program themselves. "Miss Rosalind," said Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had become one of the center's most effective organizers, "you showed us that we could be more than what others expected. Now you're going to show the whole world." The celebration was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. As the afternoon festivities were winding down, Rosalind looked up to see a familiar figure standing hesitantly in the doorway of the main hall. William Ashworth, looked older than his 30 years, his face bearing the weight of responsibilities and regrets that had accumulated since their last meeting. His expensive clothing and perfect grooming couldn't hide the weariness in his eyes or the slight stoop to his shoulders that suggested a man carrying burdens he couldn't set down. "William," she said, rising from her conversation with a group of suffragettes, "this is a surprise." "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he replied, his voice carrying the same formal politeness that had characterized their final interactions at Ashworth Manor. "I heard about your appointment at Harvard. I wanted to offer my congratulations." They moved to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the ongoing celebration. Up close, Rosalind could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the subtle signs of a man who had achieved everything society expected of him but found little satisfaction in the accomplishment. His marriage to Charlotte had produced the expected heir, a son born the previous year, but the arrangement remained more business partnership than romantic union. "Thank you," she said simply. "That's very kind of you." "It's more than kind," he replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It's the least I can do. Rosalind, I need you to know that not a day passes that I don't regret the choices I made. Watching what you've accomplished, seeing the difference you're making in the world, it makes me realize how small my own life has become." The admission was painful to hear, not because it gave her satisfaction, but because she could see the genuine anguish behind it. The William she had once loved was still there, buried under layers of duty and expectation, but visible in moments like this, when his carefully maintained facade cracked. "William, you can still choose differently. It's not too late to find your own purpose." He shook his head sadly. "I'm trapped by my own cowardice, the business, the social obligations, the expectations. I've built a cage around myself and I lack the courage to break free the way you did. Every morning I wake up and go through the motions of being the Duke of Ashworth, but I feel like I'm sleepwalking through someone else's life." "The way we both did," came Charlotte's voice as she approached them. She had been watching their conversation from across the room, and now she joined them with the easy confidence that had replaced her former brittleness. Her own transformation had been remarkable. The calculating society belle had evolved into a passionate advocate for women's rights, her sharp intelligence finally channeled toward meaningful purpose. "William, you could join us in this work. There's always room for someone who wants to make a real difference." For a moment, Rosalind saw a flicker of the old William in his eyes, the boy who had dreamed of adventure and meaningful purpose, who had once talked about traveling the world and making his mark through his own efforts rather than inherited privilege. But it faded quickly, replaced by the resigned acceptance that had become his default expression. "Perhaps," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "For now, I should let you return to your celebration. This is your day, Rosalind, and you've earned every bit of recognition you're receiving." As he prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at her one final time. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, proud of who you've become, proud of what you're accomplishing. I may have been too weak to choose love over duty, but I'm grateful that you were strong enough to choose yourself over both of us." The words carried a finality that felt like the closing of a chapter. After he left, Rosalind stood quietly for a moment, processing the encounter. There was closure in his words, a final acknowledgement of the path not taken and the wisdom of the choice she had made. But there was also sadness for the man he might have been, for the life they might have shared if circumstances had been different, for the waste of potential that his resignation represented. "Are you all right?" Elias asked, appearing at her side with his uncanny ability to sense when she needed support. "I'm perfect," she replied, and realized she meant it completely. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The celebration continued into the evening, with speeches and toasts that celebrated not just Rosalind's achievement, but the broader movement toward women's equality and social justice that she had come to represent. Local politicians spoke about the importance of education in creating social change. Religious leaders praised the center's work in serving the community's most vulnerable members. Most meaningfully, several of the center's graduates shared stories about how the programs had transformed their lives and opened opportunities they had never imagined possible. As the last guests departed and the center grew quiet, Rosalind found herself alone in her office, looking out at the city lights that twinkled like stars in the darkness. Boston spread before her, a city of contrasts where magnificent mansions stood blocks away from crowded tenements, where great universities coexisted with dangerous factories, where immense wealth and grinding poverty existed side by side. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems that remained to be solved, she felt energized by the knowledge that change was possible, one person at a time. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation for the new Harvard program. Rosalind threw herself into curriculum development, faculty recruitment, and student selection with the same intensity she had once brought to managing the Ashworth household. But this work filled her with purpose, in a way that domestic management never had. Every decision she made would shape the education of future social workers, and through them, the lives of countless people who needed advocates and allies. The application process for the program's first class revealed the hunger that existed among women for meaningful professional opportunities. Despite minimal publicity, the program was too new and experimental for extensive promotion. Applications poured in from across the country. Women wrote passionate letters about their desire to turn their volunteer charity work into professional careers. Factory workers described their dreams of becoming labor organizers. Teachers explained their frustration with educational systems that failed their most vulnerable students. The selection process was unlike anything Harvard had ever attempted. Rather than relying solely on academic credentials, Rosalind and her colleagues evaluated applicants based on their demonstrated commitment to social justice, their understanding of the problems they wanted to address, and their potential for leadership in the reform movement. The result was a diverse first class that included college graduates and self-educated women, immigrants and native-born Americans, working-class activists and wealthy reformers. Among the 12 women selected for the inaugural class was Maria Benedetti, whose application essay about the challenges facing immigrant families had moved the selection committee to tears. Also chosen was Sarah Murphy, an Irish-American factory worker who had organized successful strikes for better working conditions, and Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese-American woman whose work with San Francisco's immigrant community had gained national attention despite the discrimination she faced. The program officially launched in September 1898, with Rosalind delivering the opening lecture to a packed auditorium. Looking out at the eager faces of her students, women who had overcome enormous obstacles to be there, she felt the weight of responsibility and the thrill of possibility in equal measure. "You are pioneers," she told them, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "not just because you are among the first to study social work as a profession, but because you represent a new vision of what women can accomplish when they are given the tools and opportunity to address the world's problems systematically rather than simply offering charity." The curriculum she had developed was rigorous and comprehensive, combining theoretical study with extensive fieldwork. Students learned about economics, psychology, sociology, and political science, but they also spent time in settlement houses, factories, and tenements, seeing firsthand the conditions they hoped to change. The program's motto, inscribed above the entrance to their building, captured Rosalind's philosophy: understanding through experience, change through action. The first year of the program exceeded all expectations. The students threw themselves into their studies with the passion of people who finally had the tools to address problems they had witnessed firsthand. Their fieldwork projects produced innovative solutions to persistent social problems, new approaches to child welfare, more effective methods of labor organizing, creative strategies for immigrant integration. But perhaps more importantly, the program began to change how social problems were understood and addressed. Instead of viewing poverty, illiteracy, and poor working conditions as individual moral failings, the students learned to analyze them as systemic issues requiring coordinated responses. They studied successful reform efforts from other countries, developed new theories about the relationship between economic inequality and social problems, and created practical tools for measuring the effectiveness of intervention programs. The success of the Harvard program attracted national attention, with universities across the country requesting copies of Rosalind's curriculum and seeking her advice on establishing similar programs. She found herself traveling frequently to speak at conferences and consult with other institutions, sharing her vision of professional social work as a force for systematic social change. One particularly memorable trip took her to Chicago, where she addressed a gathering of settlement houseworkers from across the Midwest. The audience included Jane Addams, whose Hull House had become a model for social reform efforts nationwide. After Rosalind's presentation on the importance of professional training for social workers, Addams approached her with enthusiasm. "Mrs. Reed," Addams said, her eyes bright with interest, "what you're doing at Harvard represents exactly the kind of systematic approach our movement needs. Too often, we've relied on good intentions and individual heroism. You're creating a generation of professionals who understand both the theory and practice of social change." The conversation that followed led to a collaboration between Harvard's program and settlement houses across the country, creating internship opportunities for students and research partnerships that advance the field of social work. More importantly for Rosalind, it confirmed that her vision was resonating with other leaders in the reform movement. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the ripple effect her work was having on the women who encountered it. Former students were establishing settlement houses in cities across New England, bringing professional training and systematic approaches to communities that had previously relied on amateur charity efforts. Wealthy women, inspired by Charlotte's example, were redirecting their charitable efforts toward more effective interventions. Working-class women were using the skills they had learned at the center to organize labor unions and advocate for better conditions in their workplaces. The transformation was particularly evident in Boston's immigrant communities. Women who had arrived in America speaking no English and working in dangerous factories were now serving as translators, advocates, and organizers for newer arrivals. They had learned not just to read and write, but to understand their rights as workers and citizens, to navigate bureaucratic systems, and to demand better treatment for themselves and their families. One autumn evening in 1899, as Rosalind was working late in her Harvard office, she received an unexpected visitor. A knock at her door revealed a young woman she didn't immediately recognize, well-dressed but nervous, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested someone trying to make a good impression. "Professor Reed," the woman said hesitantly, "I'm sorry to disturb you so late. I'm Margaret Thornfield, Charlotte's younger sister." Rosalind invited her in, curious about what had brought Charlotte's sister to seek her out. Margaret was perhaps 20 years old, with the same blonde beauty as Charlotte, but lacking her sister's former hardness. Instead, she seemed uncertain, almost lost. "I've been following your work," Margaret began, settling into the chair across from Rosalind's desk. "Reading about the program here, hearing about what Charlotte is doing at the center, and I think I need help." The story that emerged was both familiar and heartbreaking. Margaret had been raised with the same expectations as Charlotte, to marry well and serve as an ornament to her husband's success. But unlike her sister, Margaret had never found satisfaction in social climbing and had grown increasingly depressed as her debut season approached. "Everyone expects me to be thrilled about the prospect of marriage," Margaret explained, tears beginning to form in her eyes. But when I look at the men my parents consider suitable, all I see are versions of my father, men who view women as decorative objects or useful connections. I want something more, but I don't know what that something is or how to find it. Rosalind listened with growing sympathy, remembering her own struggles with similar expectations. What interests you, Margaret? What makes you feel alive and engaged? Books, Margaret replied immediately. Learning. I've read everything in my father's library, and I've been secretly attending lectures at the public library. I'm fascinated by history, by how societies change and evolve. But my parents think too much education makes women unmarriageable. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Rosalind gradually drawing out Margaret's interests and aspirations. The young woman was clearly intelligent and thoughtful, but she had been so thoroughly trained to suppress her own desires that she barely knew what they were. "Would you be interested in auditing some classes here?" Rosalind finally suggested. "Not as a formal student. I don't think you're ready for that yet, but as a way to explore your interests and see what possibilities exist." Margaret's face lit up with hope. "Could I really do that? What would I tell my parents?" "We'll figure that out together," Rosalind assured her. "The first step is helping you discover who you are when you're not trying to be what others expect." Over the following months, Margaret became a regular presence at the centre and the university, attending lectures and gradually building confidence in her own intellectual abilities. Her transformation was gradual but profound. The uncertain girl who had first appeared at Rosalind's office evolved into a confident young woman with clear goals and the determination to achieve them. The process wasn't without challenges. Margaret's parents were initially suspicious of her new interests, and her father threatened to cut off her allowance if she continued wasting time on inappropriate pursuits. But Charlotte's support proved crucial. She had enough influence within the family to protect her sister's newfound independence and gradually convince their parents that education might actually make Margaret a more desirable marriage prospect. By the spring of 1900, Margaret had decided to apply for formal admission to the social work program. Her application essay, describing her desire to work with young women facing similar struggles with family expectations, was one of the most compelling Rosalind had ever read. "You've given me my life back," Margaret told Rosalind during one of their regular mentoring sessions. "I didn't even realize I had lost it until I started to find it again." The comment stayed with Rosalind as she reflected on the broader impact of her work. The Harvard program was training professional social workers, but it was also doing something equally important, showing women that they could define their own worth and choose their own paths, regardless of what society expected of them. As 1900 dawned, Rosalind found herself looking forward to the new century with excitement and anticipation. The work she had begun was expanding beyond anything she had originally envisioned. Her students were graduating and taking positions across the country, carrying with them not just professional skills, but a commitment to social justice that would influence their communities for generations to come. The women's suffrage movement was gaining momentum, with many of the center's graduates taking leadership roles in the campaign for voting rights. Labor organizing was becoming more sophisticated and effective, partly due to the involvement of women who had learned organizing skills through the center's programs. Most importantly, the idea that women could and should have careers focused on social change was becoming more widely accepted, opening doors for future generations that had been firmly closed just a few years earlier. On a crisp October morning in 1900, Rosalind stood once again before the Women's Educational Center, but this time she was not alone. Beside her stood Maria Benedetti, now in her final year of the Harvard program and destined to become one of the country's leading advocates for immigrant rights. Charlotte was there too, having just completed her own degree and preparing to establish a similar center in New York City. Margaret Thornfield stood with them, radiant with the confidence that came from finally knowing her own mind and having the tools to pursue her dreams. "Professor Reed," Maria said, using the title that still gave Rosalind a thrill of pride, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you had stayed at Ashworth Manor, if you had accepted the life they wanted you to live?" Rosalind considered the question seriously, looking out at the bustling street where women hurried to work, to school, to meetings where they planned campaigns for social change. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I think I would have withered away, like a plant trying to grow in the wrong soil. I needed to be transplanted somewhere I could truly flourish." "And now you're helping all of us find our own soil," Charlotte added with a smile, "teaching us that we don't have to accept the limitations others place on us." As they entered the building together, Rosalind reflected on the truth of Charlotte's words. The scared, desperate girl who had fled Ashworth Manor 6 years ago had been transformed not just by changing her circumstances, but by discovering her own capacity for growth and contribution. She had learned that worth was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed and demonstrated through one's actions and choices. The morning brought its usual flurry of activity, students arriving for classes, mothers dropping off children at the daycare center, volunteers organizing relief efforts for the latest wave of immigrants arriving at Boston's docks. But underlying all the bustle was a sense of purpose and possibility that energized everyone who entered the building. During her lunch break, Rosalind received a letter that brought unexpected news. The return address bore the Ashworth family crest, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, she found a brief note from the family's attorney, informing her that Duchess Margaret had passed away suddenly the previous week. The funeral had been a grand affair attended by all of New York society, but the letter's real purpose was to inform her of an unexpected bequest. In recognition of her years of faithful service to the Ashworth family, the letter read, "Her Grace has left the sum of $50,000 to Miss Rosalind Hayes, to be used for charitable purposes as she sees fit." Rosalind stared at the letter in amazement. $50,000 was an enormous sum, enough to fund the center's operations for years or to establish similar programs in other cities. But more than the money itself, the bequest represented something she had never expected, acknowledgement from the woman who had dismissed her so cruelly that her work had value and meaning. That evening, as she shared the news with Elias over dinner in their comfortable home near Harvard Square, she found herself thinking about forgiveness and the complex ways that people's stories intersected and influenced each other. Their house had become a gathering place for reformers and intellectuals, a salon where ideas were debated and plans for social change were hatched over simple meals and strong coffee. "She must have been watching your work," Elias observed, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth, "following your career, seeing what you accomplished. Perhaps in the end she understood that she had been wrong about your worth. Or perhaps," Rosalind replied thoughtfully, "she realized that worth isn't something that can be measured by birth or breeding, but by what we choose to do with the opportunities we're given." The bequest from Duchess Margaret allowed Rosalind to expand her work in ways she had only dreamed of. She used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for working-class women who wanted to attend the Harvard program but lacked the financial resources. Another portion went toward creating a research institute focused on developing new approaches to social problems. The remainder was invested to provide ongoing support for the center's operations. But perhaps the most meaningful use of the money was the establishment of a network of similar centers in cities across the country. Working with her graduates and other reform leaders, Rosalind helped establish women's educational centers in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco. Each center was adapted to the specific needs of its community, but all shared the same commitment to empowering women through education and providing them with the tools to create social change. As 1901 dawned, Rosalind found herself at the center of a movement that was transforming American society. The professional social work field that had begun with her small program at Harvard was now recognized as a legitimate discipline, with programs being established at universities across the country. More importantly, the women who had graduated from these programs were making real differences in their communities, reducing infant mortality rates, improving working conditions, expanding educational opportunities, and advocating for political reforms. The ripple effects of her work extended far beyond the formal programs she had established. Women who had attended classes at the center were now teaching their own daughters that they could aspire to careers beyond marriage and motherhood. Immigrant families were sending their daughters to school instead of immediately putting them to work in factories. Working-class women were organizing unions and demanding better treatment from their employers. On a warm spring evening in 1901, Rosalind stood on the roof of the Women's Educational Center, looking out over the city that had become her home and the site of her greatest achievements. Boston spread before her, a city that was changing slowly but surely as more women found their voices and claimed their right to participate fully in society. Elias joined her on the roof, carrying 2 glasses of wine and wearing the contented expression of a man who had found his life's work. His own career had flourished alongside hers. His research on economic inequality had influenced policy discussions in Washington, and his book on urban poverty had become required reading in universities across the country. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing her a glass and settling beside her on the bench they had placed there for quiet moments like this. "I'm thinking about seeds," she replied, accepting the wine and leaning against his shoulder. "About how sometimes you have to be uprooted from where you think you belong in order to find where you can truly grow. About how the most beautiful gardens are often planted in the most unexpected places." She thought about the women whose lives had been transformed by the programs she had created. Maria, now working with immigrant families in New York. Margaret, preparing to establish a center for young women in Philadelphia. Charlotte, using her social connections to advocate for labor reform, and dozens of others who had found their own paths to meaningful work and personal fulfillment. "And I'm thinking about legacy," she continued, watching the lights begin to twinkle in windows across the city. "Not the kind of legacy that comes from having your name on buildings or being remembered in history books, but the kind that lives on in the lives you've touched and the changes you've helped create." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Rosalind reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had once believed her value depended on marrying well had become a woman who understood that her greatest contribution lay not in who she married, but in how she chose to serve the world. The desperate ward who had fled Ashworth Manor in shame had become a respected professor and reformer whose work was changing lives across the country. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that true happiness came not from meeting others' expectations, but from discovering and pursuing her own authentic path. The life she had built with Elias, the work she had created, the women she had empowered, all of it had grown from the courage to reject what others thought she should want and pursue what she knew she needed. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rosalind raised her glass in a silent toast to the women who had come before her and fought for the opportunities she had been able to seize, to the women working beside her to create change in the present, and to the generations of women who would inherit a world where their worth was not determined by others' approval, but by their own choices and contributions. The girl who had once been told she was unworthy had become a woman who understood that worth was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed and demonstrated through one's own actions. And in that understanding, she had found not just personal fulfillment, but a legacy that would inspire countless others to reject the limitations placed upon them and demand the right to define their own destinies. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities and challenges, but she faced it with the confidence that came from knowing she had found her true calling. She had learned to bloom where she chose to plant herself, and in doing so, she had created a garden where countless other women could discover their own capacity for growth and contribution. What an incredible journey we've witnessed together. From the gilded halls of Ashworth Manor to the bustling classrooms of the Boston Women's Educational Center, we've seen how one woman's courage to reject society's limitations transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who had been told they were unworthy. Rosalind's story reminds us that our worth is never determined by others' opinions or society's expectations, but by our own choices and the courage to pursue our authentic path. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin when we're forced to leave behind what we thought we wanted and discover what we truly need. If this story of resilience, transformation, and the power of choosing yourself resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring historical tales of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are worthy of their dreams, regardless of what others might say. And tell us in the comments, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? What dreams have you put aside because others told you they weren't appropriate for someone like you? Your story matters, and like Rosalind, you have the power to write your own ending. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to bloom where you choose to plant yourself. Subscribe now, and let's continue exploring the stories of those who dared to defy expectations and change the world.